Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Doug Hudson. He's the Vice President for Public Sector at Orca Security. Doug, it's good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
And our topic today is cloud security and commercial cloud services providers security. And let's begin by, from your experience, the major differences between the way the federal government has gone about adopting cloud services and how industry has. And then we'll get into some of the security implications of that.
No, it sounds good. So, coming from Orca and on the public sector side, looking at the delta between the federal adoption or public sector adoption and commercial adoption, it has been very fascinating. I think that generally you've seen the commercial side kind of rush to adopt cloud and cloud native solutions for a lot of different reasons. There's scalability, there's flexibility, there's dynamic capabilities within the cloud. On the federal side or the public sector side, it's been a much slower adoption rate. You do see some agencies and some state and local folks that have been much quicker to adopt the cloud. I think the big difference is the view of security around the cloud, where traditionally, for an agency or even a commercial entity, having a fixed data center where you knew who had access, you could control that, and then transitioning that to this cloud ecosystem that's somewhere else, and I can't touch my server, I can't do those things, I think has led to some irrational slowness in adoption. I also think that when we talk about adoption for the Fed, you're seeing it really come more as a mandate coming from an administration, and whether it be this administration or the previous one to that, you've seen this push towards modernization and modernizing the federal workforce, modernizing their infrastructure. So it's almost been more by mandate than necessarily taking advantage of the scalability, flexibility, services that are in the cloud.
Interesting. And so that gets to the question then of what services for security you feel comfortable in using from the cloud. Because the cloud service providers have really long catalogs of services, including security. And so maybe tell us what, from the commercial standpoint or the ideal federal standpoint, a cloud security architecture or plan should look like.
So that's a layered question, in a good way. I think first it depends on what the goal is, and how you're starting that process. If you're standing up a new environment and you're going to do things wholly new, so essentially from the ground up, you have the opportunity to build in security. And so what does that mean? When you think about from a CSP perspective and from the agency perspective, what am I putting in the cloud? Why am I putting it there and building it from the ground up? So what does that mean? That means things like what availability zones do you want to use? That means things like what types of workloads, secure workloads, pre-compliant built workloads, those sorts of things, or pre-certified, if you will, security certified applications or services. So if you're doing that from a ground up, you have a much more robust way to kind of build in that security from the ground up. You're able to inherit more controls. You're able to have better control from an operations standpoint because you're not lifting and shifting. When we start talking about lifting and shifting, which is one of the paradigms that a lot of the federal agencies are going through right now, which is modernizing and moving from that traditional on-prem data center to a cloud solution, you're talking about migrating applications and services. That requires a different level of, I'll say, technological sophistication. I know that's kind of a goofy term, but that requires a lot more sophistication because the app that was built to work in a data center. And the services aren't a one-to-one match necessarily in the cloud for a lot of different reasons. And it goes all the way down to things like ports and protocols that you may have in your data center that either are not available or treated in a different way in the cloud. We can look at it from a zero trust perspective and locking into a specific port, which you can do a lot easier in a native data center environment. Whereas in a cloud environment, you're going to deal with things like scalability and containers and serverless features. Those use a lot of ephemeral ports. So having that one-to-one match doesn't necessarily work. So you end up, when you're transitioning, is a lot of bolt-on security in that cloud instance. So when you look at the security architecture, it's always, trite to say, but what is the end goal? What are your requirements? And how do you plan to support this across the organization? Because again, you're not just serving your clientele externally, you've also got to serve your internal folks.
Right, so the big technical difference then, the way you've described it, is without the hardware, you're dealing with everything as a software construct.
Yes.
And that makes your security model different than when you have a combination of hardware and software.
Absolutely correct. And if you were to bake it down, and everybody's heard, or most people have heard, zero trust is a big thing these days. And so is the software bill of materials, or SBOM. The reason that those are becoming more and more prevalent is because of the access. And you're absolutely right. You've got all these applications, all these services that you can use, turn on, scale up within the cloud that weren't traditionally available in your native data center, if you will. Now you're really at the construct, when you talk security architecture, of access. So I didn't really want to get into that, because access is a very interesting construct. You start to get into, again, the zero trust and what has access to what, or who has access to what, down to a very, very specific layer.
Okay. Well, then that gets to the question of the inherited controls you mentioned earlier. If you have controls in your data center and you're doing that lift and shift, as many agencies are, can those controls go with it? How do they get rendered in the cloud, or do you have to really rethink everything?
So you don't really have to rethink everything. Your construct of thinking in how you're going to operate does have to change. But I think when you start talking about inherited controls, it's one of the nice things that the CSPs bring to the table. When we're talking specifically about federal government work, there are specific authorized federal clouds that the agencies are allowed to work in. AWS is GovCloud, it's Azure for government, GCP has their own stuff as well. The point being is that in those clouds, they have already set the foundational components from a control perspective. So if we look at it from a traditional data center perspective, and I'll make this a pretty simple analogy, but in the data center, you would have to control who has the access cards and who can get access to the data center. Then you have those cards of who can get access to your cage, and then you've probably got some level of access control to access that specific server. The nice thing in the cloud is you don't have to worry about that physical access. That is handled by the CSP, Amazon, AWS, GCP, etc. That is handled by them. So physical controls you're able to inherit. Some of the baseline operational controls from either an OS, a server, a container, serverless or a container, you're able to inherit those as well. So there's a plethora of baseline controls that make it a lot easier, and this goes on both federal as well as commercial. Much more so on the federal side, especially whether it be an agency or somebody looking to work with an agency, they're able to get those secure workloads already, I would say, pre-configured at a base layer that already have the right ports, the right protocols, the other components, access controls that are built in. So you kind of get the opportunity to go and layer your application, your service on that pre-built compliant environment. What's nice is all the CSPs provide ostensibly a RACI matrix, so that any entity that wants to know what are my controls that I have to be responsible for, and what are those controls that the CSP is going to carry, those are readily available in public. So it's very easy to go, okay, I'm going to go do X, and what am I going to be responsible for from a customer perspective, and what is the CSP? They call it a shared responsibility model. It's publicly available. It's easy. Just search it, and you can figure out specifically what pertains to you, what you have to do. And if we go back, on the conversation, this also is part of that secure architecture. Where what am I doing? How do I deliver what I want to deliver to my customers, you can start to then layer in, this is how I'm going to build the environment securely, because I know that I've got these controls that I'm responsible for, and these other controls the CSP is responsible for. So now you start that better transition or migration to that cloud service.
So can this all be embodied in your service level agreements such that everyone knows what they're supposed to do?
It is absolutely, it's already baked into the services agreement, whether it be AWS or GCP or Azure or Oracle. I guess IBM also has a cloud too. Sorry, IBM. But in all seriousness, it is baked into the contracts. It's, again, publicly available. They state clearly, we are going to patch the base OS system. It is your responsibility to manage the access to it. And I'm using that as a very, very super basic example.
But you need different skills then, really, on the part of your own agency staff to manage a cloud environment versus what they might have known about how to operate in their own data center.
Yes and no, right? Some of the basic constructs are the same, and I think at the base construct level, when you start talking about access controls and you start talking about network segmentation and some of those base features like base OS, I think a lot of those skills that were in the data center are transferable. When you start talking about containers and scalability, and you start talking about APIs and pulling together a bunch of disparate things to create something better, I do see that there is a need to have a new or enhanced skill set. You know, the beautiful part of the CSPs, they're coming out with new features, new services almost on a daily basis, if not an hourly basis. Keeping up with that can be extremely challenging. And so understanding some of how you can manage that it is a new skill set to be developed. Did that answer your question? I think it did.
I think so, yeah. I mean, but there's a human capital question for any kind of a cloud major project.
Well, that's the proverbial gag with the cloud. And the CSPs will probably kill me for this, but it's the truth. A lot of folks see moving from a traditional data center to a cloud, and this goes on the commercial side as well as the federal side, that there's going to be this oodles of savings. Because now I don't have the infrastructure to support a physical data center. I don't have to support physical servers. I don't have to deal with the weekly, monthly, whatever updates of the services that my application or my services ride on. You're absolutely right when you bring in the human capital part. There's a human capital investment to make sure you've got the right resources to be able to manage. There is training that should or needs to occur, whether it be self or any of the available trainings from the CSPs or other entities. But there is a human capital part of it. And there's also the where we talk about controls, one of the beautiful things is the scalability of the cloud. You have much more scalability in the cloud than you do in a traditional data center. Well, great. And this is where, again, some of that cost comes in. Because I have virtually infinite scalability, you see a lot of folks not understanding what that means and having way more, I'm just going to say, stuff than they intended to, where they were locked into a physical X in a data center. They're locked into a virtual Y in the cloud that they can scale, almost infinite. So you do see some of that cost delta where the savings isn't necessarily there that people are anticipating. However, there is savings when you start thinking about all the patching, all the operational human capital piece that you brought up. There is savings on that in the long term because you're not having to manage that stuff where the CSP is managing it.
But in the meantime, in the short run, it takes a certain amount of dollars to run a certain number of instruction cycles with a certain amount of data, regardless of whether it's your data center or the cloud, which you're paying by the month for.
Yep, absolutely. And again, the nice thing, one of the nice things, and I guess I'm a cloud expert.
Sound like one to me.
One of the really nice things about the cloud is the availability of data that can help you do what you need to do. It's readily available. It's very quick. It may add time to a deployment, but the CSPs are providing exactly what you need to do, how you need to do it. They provide instructions, and then obviously there's YouTube and a bunch of other stuff out there. So the resources to be able to go out and deliver, update, fix, patch, whatever, are much more readily available for cloud than they ever, at least in my opinion, than they ever were in a traditional data center.
And how does the whole compliance picture change when you're in the cloud? You've got FedRAMP attestation. Nobody can say we have zero trust, or they can say it, but it's hard to verify. Then SBOM, that's another mandate. I mean, federal agencies have a lot of things they have to comply with legally, regulatory, and just White House policy-wise.
It's unpacking compliance in the cloud is an interesting conversation. The cool part about it is we're now talking about data elements. So PII, HIPAA data, CUI data, government data, DoD data, like ITAR data. We can go down all the different acronyms. We're now talking about managing those at a specific data element or data point layer. So theoretically, the ability to control and build an environment that is compliant with a regulatory requirement, again, is a little easier, right? I say a little. When we start to unpack this, one of the interesting challenges, and I'll get to the FedRAMP, SBOM, Zero Trust thing here in a second. When we start to unpack it, specifically in the cloud, the interesting thing, I brought up the scalability, is that you have a lot of what I'll call data spillage, where you stand up a bunch of stuff and now all of a sudden you've got this X regulated data that's fallen into this Y location. So that data spillage now becomes much more prevalent because it's a different type of control that you need to have in place, which is why you're seeing the big mandates for things like FedRAMP. You see the big things for Zero Trust. You've also got CMMC or 800-171. All these are really predicated on protecting that data element and avoiding spillage. So when you start talking about these compliant regimes or these compliant regulations, the really nice part of it is they're very, very prescriptive. They tell you this is a 1 or a 0. And so when you're going through it, it really resonates that, hey, if I do X, right, I'm okay, but if I do Y, I'm not. So again, when you start looking at these regulations, it's nice because it gives a foundation for for the private-public partnership to be able to come together. And if you extract it to a different layer, it's also forcing organizations to have better security. When we start talking about Zero Trust and how that folds into these things, again, it's about the data element. It's about the access to a particular service system or data, right? And at the end of the day, it's all about the data. So when we start talking about Zero Trust, it's getting into, you've heard terms like microsegmentation, but it's a specific, I can access this piece of data, but I cannot access that piece of data. And I can be a person, it can be a machine, it can be a serverless function, it can be a container, but it's controlling that at a one-to-one level. Now, the interesting thing is that this has been encouraged through various OMBs and executive directives coming from the White House that thou shalt have Zero Trust.
Right.
It's a lot easier to talk about it than it is to do it. Partly because the systems are already built, they've already been deployed, but it's also very cumbersome. You brought up the human capital piece. You've got to have the ability to go through and look granularly at what or who can access what or who. And that's a very time-consuming operation. Then you've got to build out the framework to say, okay, this can do this, but this cannot do that. So it is a long, winding road. I do think Zero Trust is something that, from a security perspective, we should have been doing for years. I think it's a really good branding and marketing term. But yeah, I think back to the compliance thing. It's a good thing. It's a challenging thing, but I think it's a necessary evil.
And in the few seconds we have left, it's fair to say that Orca has the capability of protecting all of an agency's assets in the cloud, regardless of the cloud they're in.
That is correct. we are a cloud native application protection platform or a cloud security posture management platform. We are 100% native. We are able to see across cloud ecosystems, both commercial and federal, to be able to determine everything that is in that environment, whether it's one CSP or multiple CSPs, all the way down to the foundational level to identify the risks and vulnerabilities that could cause harm to an organization.
All right, you've given us some great things to think about. I want to thank today's guest is Doug Hudson, the Vice President for Public Sector at Orca Security. I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin. You're watching Federal News Network. Let's go back to the studio now for more on the Industry Exchange Cloud.